Imagine a country that, for a while, seemed to have cracked a code that much of Latin America was still searching for. Fast modernization, rising incomes, a currency that felt solid, and cities that looked, at least in parts, like a confident, oil-powered version of the future. That country was Venezuela. This episode is about Venezuela's economic peak, its best era in popular memory, and the long slide that follows, ending in one of the most dramatic collapses recorded in a country not destroyed by war. We'll focus on the economic story, how a petro economy can create extraordinary prosperity, why that prosperity can be fragile, and how a chain of political and policy decisions, layered on top of structural dependence, can turn abundance into scarcity. 1. The moment oil rewrote the country. Venezuela did not always revolve around oil. But once large-scale oil production took off in the 20th century, it reshaped almost everything. The state, the currency, the labor market, the cities, even people's expectations of what normal life should look like. Oil is not just another export. It is a source of foreign currency, government revenue, and geopolitical leverage. When oil money enters a developing economy at scale, it can finance highways, schools, hospitals, public jobs, and imported consumer goods quickly, sometimes faster than institutions can adapt to manage it. In the mid-20th century, Venezuela became a magnet. Growth and opportunity drew immigrants. Caracas expanded and modernized. A middle class widened. For many Venezuelans, the idea formed that the country's destiny was to be rich, because the ground beneath it was rich. There's a key psychological element here. When a nation's wealth seems to come from geology, prosperity can feel permanent. But the price of oil is not permanent, and the quality of governance is not guaranteed. That tension is the seed of the story. 2. Best era, prosperity, and the logic of the petrostate. When people talk about Venezuela's golden age, they often mean the decades when oil revenue was high and living standards rose visibly. In historical comparisons, Venezuela was once among the world's leaders in income per person, a startling fact when placed next to the country's present condition. But to understand how it felt on the ground, don't picture only luxury. Picture something broader. Imported goods widely available, a currency that made travel and shopping abroad plausible for more than a tiny elite, and an expanding state able to hire, build, subsidize, and promise. Oil revenue made it possible for the government to act as the central engine of the economy. And that created a particular model. The state collects oil income in foreign currency. The state converts and spends it locally, on jobs, contracts, subsidies, and imports. Local business often grows by supplying the state or by distributing imported goods financed by oil dollars. Citizens come to expect the state to cushion hardship, stabilize prices, and guarantee access. This model can work, up to a point, when oil prices are strong and institutions are disciplined, but it creates vulnerabilities that are easy to ignore during the boom. 3. The hidden cost of easy money, Dutch disease, and the crowding out of everything else. One of the most important long-run explanations is structural. When a country earns a huge share of its money from one export, especially one as valuable as oil, the local currency tends to strengthen or be kept artificially strong. Imports become cheap. That feels great for consumers. Shelves fill with foreign goods. But for domestic producers, it can be lethal. Local manufacturing and agriculture struggle to compete with cheaper imports. Over time, the economy becomes lopsided. Oil dominates export earnings and state revenue. Non-oil sectors become weaker, less competitive, less productive. The country imports more of what it eats, wears, and uses. When oil revenue falls, there isn't a strong non-oil base to stabilize the economy. This is not unique to Venezuela. Many resource-rich countries face it. But Venezuela's dependence was extreme, and that made the future more fragile than the boom years suggested. 4. The 1970s, boom psychology and the temptation to build a nation overnight. The 1970s oil shocks created a global surge in oil prices, and Venezuela's government revenue expanded dramatically. In such moments, politics becomes a competition not over scarcity but over distribution. Who gets how much of the windfall, how fast, and through what channels? Boom. Revenue encourages big promises. Massive public investment programs, expansion of state-owned enterprises, subsidies and price controls to share the wealth, public employment and wage growth. This is also the era when many countries, Venezuela included, leaned toward greater state control of the oil industry. Nationalization can be defended as sovereignty. The nation should capture a larger share of its own resource wealth. And for a time, the state oil company can become a symbol of national competence. But there's a risk. Once the state is funded by oil rents, it can become less dependent on taxpayers. When governments rely less on broad taxation, they can become less accountable to ordinary citizens, and politics can turn into rent-seeking. A fight over access to the oil stream, rather than a fight over productivity. 5. The turn from permanent boom to debt, devaluation, and broken confidence. The moment that many Venezuelans remember as a historical break is the early 1980s, when the illusion of an always strong currency shattered. Oil prices weakened and financial pressures built. Eventually, Venezuela devalued and introduced complex exchange arrangements and controls. This matters because it changes expectations. Before that break, people could imagine a stable, predictable, economic life. After it, uncertainty enters, inflation, currency instability, capital flight, and the sense that the country's normal is no longer normal. From here, Venezuela faces a classic trap. Once the state and the population become accustomed to a certain standard of living financed by oil, it becomes politically difficult to adjust when revenue falls. To maintain spending, governments often borrow. Borrowing can smooth volatility in the short term, but it can also postpone reforms and deepen dependence. When the next shock comes, debt and weak non-oil sectors make recovery harder. 6. The 1990s, reforms, backlash, and the political opening to a new model. When economic systems strain for long enough, politics changes. Social frustration rises, especially when austerity or reforms are perceived as unfair. Venezuela experienced intense unrest in this period, and the legitimacy of the traditional political order eroded. This matters for the story because Venezuela's later policy choices did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from disappointment, a population that had lived through boom, then lived through broken promises, then became willing to try a radically different approach. 7. The 2000s. High oil prices return, and the country doubles down on the petrostate. In the 2000s, oil prices rose again. Venezuela's government once more had major oil income, and it chose a path that mixed expansive social programs with deeper state control of the economy. Here's where the decline becomes less about bad luck and more about policy structure. Several mechanisms are crucial. A. Exchange controls and the creation of a two-economy system. When a government controls access to foreign currency, it effectively controls who can import, who can travel, who can buy key inputs, and who gets subsidized dollars. If the official exchange rate is kept far from reality, the system creates enormous incentives for corruption and arbitrage. Obtain dollars cheaply at the official rate and resell them indirectly at a much higher market value. In theory, exchange controls can defend reserves and stabilize prices. In practice, if mismanaged and maintained too long, they can strangle production and create a permanent shortage economy because firms cannot reliably access foreign inputs, spare parts, or raw materials. B. price controls, and the logic of shortages. Price controls are politically attractive. They promise affordability. But if controlled prices fall below the cost of production or import, suppliers stop supplying. Producers reduce output. Importers hesitate. And shortages appear. Once shortages appear, governments often respond with more controls, more inspections, more restrictions, more rationing. That can worsen the incentives to produce, pushing more activity into informal markets. See the state oil company as a spending arm. In many petro states, the national oil company becomes more than an energy firm. It becomes a financial artery for the political project, funding social programs, public works, subsidies, and sometimes off-budget spending that bypasses normal checks. If, at the same time, investment in maintenance and production is reduced, output can decline. And when output declines, the country loses the very revenue needed to sustain its model. D. Rising dependence during the boom. One of the most paradoxical things that can happen in an oil boom is that dependence increases rather than decreases. Cheap imports, an overvalued currency, and a state-centric economy can weaken domestic production further, so when the boom ends, the country is even less prepared than before. 8. 2014 and after the collapse sequence. The mid-2010s mark the point where Venezuela's economy enters a catastrophic spiral. Oil revenue falls sharply with global price movements, but revenue loss alone does not explain the magnitude of the collapse. The severity is linked to the fact that Venezuela's economy had already become brittle. Heavy reliance on oil exports, damaged domestic production, controls that distorted incentives, and fiscal imbalance. Once the state can't earn enough foreign currency, it can't import at prior levels. But if the country is dependent on imports for food, medicine, industrial inputs, and consumer goods, import compression becomes a social crisis. Then comes the monetary dimension. When governments face large deficits and limited financing, they may turn to the central bank, creating money to cover spending. In a normal context, that raises inflation. In a collapsed confidence context, where people expect the currency to lose value, it can explode into hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is not just prices rising. It is the destruction of money as a social tool. Salaries become meaningless between paychecks. Savings evaporate. Planning becomes impossible. Contracts become short-term. People shift to barter, dollars, or anything that holds value. At the same time, oil production declines further due to underinvestment, operational problems, and loss of capacity. And as production falls, so does the state's main source of foreign currency, a feedback loop. International sanctions also become part of the later stage picture, complicating financing, trade, and oil sector operations. In debates about causality, some argue sanctions are central. Others argue the economy was already collapsing before the most stringent measures. What is clear is that, in an already weakened system, additional constraints can accelerate decline and limit recovery options. 9. So what caused Venezuela's decline? Really, a layered explanation. If you want a single villain, you won't get an honest answer. Venezuela's collapse is better understood as layers that built over time. Layer 1. Extreme oil dependence. When one commodity dominates export earnings and government revenue, the whole economy becomes a hostage to global prices and domestic production capacity. Layer 2. Institutional fragility and political incentives. Boom. Money can weaken accountability. When the state can spend oil revenue instead of collecting taxes, politics can turn into a struggle over distribution rather than productivity. Corruption risks rise because access to dollars and contracts becomes the path to wealth. Layer 3. Policy choices that amplify distortions. Exchange controls, price controls, and heavy discretionary allocation systems can create shortages, black markets, and investment flight. especially when maintained through changing realities. Layer 4. The weakening of domestic production. Cheap imports and currency distortions undermine local industry and agriculture. Once domestic capacity is lost, it's hard to rebuild quickly. Layer 5. The collapse loop. Falling oil revenue, plus falling oil output, plus fiscal deficits, plus money creation, plus collapsing confidence. Hyperinflation and deep contraction. Add external constraints, like sanctions, and the loop tightens. 10. The human meaning of an economic collapse. At the end of this story is not a chart, but it's daily life. When an economy collapses at this scale, poverty is not just low income. It is unreliable food, missing medicines, shrinking opportunities, mass migration, and the loss of future planning. People don't only become poorer, they lose the ability to trust the basic systems that make modern life function. And this is what makes Venezuela's story so haunting. It wasn't always poor. Many Venezuelans carry living memory, or inherited memory, of a country that felt prosperous, modern, and upward moving. That contrast intensifies the trauma. Closing thought. Venezuela's rise and fall is not a morality play where resource wealth automatically corrupts. It's a lesson in fragility. How a nation can appear rich while building an economy that is dangerously dependent, and how political incentives during booms can lay the track for collapse when conditions change. If there is a single takeaway, it's this: oil can finance development, but it cannot substitute for it. A country can import prosperity for a while, but sooner or later, prosperity has to be produced.